Welcome, dear reader, to a candlelit corner of the old world, where superstition lingers like mist and inked pages still whisper of wolves and ruins, of letters sealed and secrets kept. Together, we'll read through the shadows of Bram Stoker's Dracula, chapter by chapter, hearthlight by hush. So brew something warm, light a candle if you like, and let's step quietly into the dark. If you'd like to support these deep dive literary explorations, you can find my Buy Me a Coffee, my favorite pen, and some fun notebooks, as well as basic versus bougie book options for this text, linked down in the video description. Thank you for helping me keep the candles lit. In Dracula, Chapter 3, we have the journal entry for May 8th continued. Jonathan mentions that he behaves like a rat in a trap, and he's frantic and very nervous about his discoveries, realizations. But he composes himself enough to calm down, and so he sits down and starts to contemplate and think about things, and he decides that it's probably best that if he keeps his conclusions about him being a prisoner from the Count, and he determines to keep his eyes open to what's going on. So Jonathan, determining to be very aware of everything that's happening, he pays close attention and he hears when the Count returns, and he spies Count Dracula making Jonathan Harker's bed or setting the table for the meal. And all of this confirms to Jonathan there are no servants here. It's Count Dracula doing everything and me. Jonathan Harker realizes he must have been the driver that picked him up the night he arrived at this castle. And he once again questions, what was that when Dracula seemed to have this sway, this control over the wild wolves? And now we have Jonathan feeling very grateful for all of the superstitious gifts that the townspeople, the folk people, gifted him. Jonathan mentions the rosary that the Golden Crone woman gifted him, and he starts to wonder at the nature of all of these objects. He was taught to consider things of that sort to be idolatrous and disfavorable, but he now has this appreciation for them. They do seem to make a difference. He kind of wonders, is the helpfulness from the essence of the actual object itself, or is it because it carries with it and conveys the memories of care? Those are questions that I would also urge you to think about, and if you feel so inclined, to comment on down below. Objects that carry spiritual significance, these talismans, is it the essence of the thing itself, or is it that it is this tangible conveyor of other people's intentions and care? So then back to the chapter. Jonathan thinks about that, and then he determines that again he's going to try and get the Count to continue to talk about himself, and he's going to try and do this in subtle ways, but he wants to figure out who his captor is, essentially. Hours later, it's midnight, which technically now means the journal entry has gone into May 9th, I believe. Jonathan does talk to the Count. He does manage to get the Count to talk about himself. The way he does this, it comes quite easily because all he has to do is ask about Transylvanian history. So Count Dracula proceeds to talk about wars of that area and the people who inhabited that area in a language that is very inclusive of himself, almost as if he was part of it, as he experienced it. When he speaks of battles, it sounds like he was a participant. It sounds like he was there, and he uses we. And this could also be read, as a nobleman being the leader of a people and the heir of a culture, that use of we, but that pronoun could also be seen as, again, his actual presence there. And then Count Dracula, he does address this, and he says it's a point of pride so for his people, and so that's why he uses the we. But Jonathan notices it. We should notice it as a reader and question it. Dracula then talks about his race, his ethnicity of people, and I am not confident in the exact pronunciation of this. Phonetically reading the word, I would say Szeleklis is what he refers to as his race. But take a look at that in the text yourself. So if you feel like I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, you can know how you would prefer to phonetically read that word. So it's Szekelys though. And Count Dracula describes it as a people whose blood, who is very lion-like in their bravery. He mentions a tribe from Iceland whose fighting spirits were nurtured by the gods of that area, like Thor, and he says Woden. You may be more familiar with the name Odin. And he talks about berserkers descending on Europe, Asia, and Africa that were so wild and vicious that people thought they were werewolves, and that's how they described them, and they said that the werewolves had come. Then the Count mentions a legend that he remarks on as foolish, and that legend being the Huns were the result of witches mating with devils in the desert. And again, Dracula says this is a foolish legend, and he says that he himself has Attila's blood running in his own veins. He goes on to talk about how his race is able to so successfully push invaders back. He talks about how his race, the Szeleklis, were the ones to guard the land, and that it was a Dracula, so someone of his direct line, who crossed the Danube and beat the Turks on their own land. And then he just continues to go on about the exploits and the glories of his family and his people. Dracula then talks about how Dracula alone is the one to emerge and go on, even from all of the troops being slaughtered. It was a Dracula who was able to go on, was destined to be the one to triumph. And Dracula gets very animated and engaged in this, and he talks about how this person was accused of being selfish, and he says, what good are peasants without a leader? And he says war needs brain and heart to conduct it. And so you can just tell he has this immense, passionate, almost violent pride in his race and his people and the exploits of war and dominion and control. And he mentions some large family names that you might be familiar with, even just from history class, like the Habsburgs or the Romanovs. And he talks about them in a very demeaning way. He calls them mushroom growths. And, think about that, a fungal growth that rose from the rot of a former glorious thing. That's his way of saying that these powerful, well-known families pale in comparison to the Dracula and Szeleki line. Dracula talks about how the war days now are over. Again, Jonathan Harker is a product of a Victorian era, and we are coming at a lot of the topics in this book we should be looking at it at how a Victorian reader and mind would have understood it. And so for Dracula now being in that era, yes, the violent centuries past, to him war is over. And he talks about blood being too precious in these days of dishonorable peace. And I think I'm going to make a separate video diving more into that line, because it stood out to me, and I think it's a very interesting thing to dissect and to kind of take a deeper look at. But essentially, he feels that peace these days is taking away the chance for really proving oneself, and that it is not an honorable way to live the way that people are living now. We have to look at it as Dracula being this warrior prince who, you know, he had his people and they were fierce defenders of Europe against the Ottoman Empire. And Dracula is claiming this noble blood that is noble and honorable, or was, because it was a leadership given by being a descendant of warriors who fought bravely to defend their homeland. We can press pause here because Dracula himself is inspired by the man Vlad Dracul, who did lead a very successful military campaign and did stand out as a fearless but extremely brutal defender and leader of his people. So Dracula, or Count Dracula, our character in Bram Stoker's novel, he talks about his Dracula line, perhaps himself, being the only one who had the will and the strength and the leadership to endure. Here, I think as readers and as people familiar with the legend of Dracula and the stories of vampires, we can start to see it as touching a little bit on the supernatural. How old is this guy? You may be asking yourself. And the text itself, I think, is definitely offering that up, but it isn't fully quite yet touching on the supernatural. It is pushing us towards that larger mythic aura to our character, Count Dracula, and the atmosphere that Jonathan Harker is finding himself in. When Dracula talks about these days of dishonorable peace and how blood is viewed as too precious in the modern, for this time, lens, he is really speaking with words that are just dripping with disdain. He's coming at it with criticism of a world that is way too concerned with being too diplomatic and soft and honestly just unworthy of heroic characters anymore. He feels that peace is dishonorable because it's not even being tested. There's no way for men's courage and leadership to be tested because there's this over concern with diplomacy and political correctness. And Drac feels that his era was one of action and glory and sacrifice. And for Dracula, he's glorifying violence and conquest as noble virtues, and it's reinforcing this idea that Dracula's old world values not quite fitting into the worldview of the Victorian era Jonathan Harker. He goes through the night talking with and listen, well, I guess it seems like primarily listening to Count Dracula, and he says the cock crows morning and their conversation ends, and he says that it's starting to feel like the story of Arabian Nights, or he references Shakespeare's Hamlet. And these allusions, I think, kind of touch on the atmosphere that Bram Stoker is creating in the novel. With the reference to Arabian Nights, it does have this association of exotic wonder and the uncanny. it does kind of reference that Jonathan is in this twilight zone between dream and nightmare. And like the woman who's telling these stories in Arabian Nights, Dracula is bound by the night and powerless to the dawn. And our character Jonathan Harker, his survival is tied also to these cycles of night and day. And then with this reference to Hamlet, in Shakespeare's Hamlet, the character, Hamlet's father, is a ghost, is a spectral figure, and disappears at the sound of the rooster crowing in the morning. And so it does mark this boundary between the holy daytime ruled by God and the unholy, the dark, where spirits are just kind of running loose. The rooster crowing, it does carry with it this symbol of truth dispelling deception. And it shows that Dracula's power is limited by divine order. Dawn reasserts God's authority in this context. And that being said, I do want to invite you to consider the symbolism and the allusion of the crowing of the rooster to biblical stories. Think about Peter and what the crowing of the rooster implies in that context. We could understand it as an indication of truth being revealed and marking that battle between faith and frailty. Perhaps the crowing signals both vulnerability and this hope of renewal. I mentioned cycles a moment ago, but also this cycle of redemption, Jonathan's own eventual awakening into agency and courage, also being a mere reflection of the biblical context of the crowing of the rooster. So that closes that journal entry. And then we have a journal entry marked with the date the 12th of May. Jonathan says that he is going to be hyper-focused on the facts. He says that the Count comes to him and asks about having a multitude of solicitors working for him. The Count mentions that he wants to be the one whose wishes are being granted. He wants only his wishes to be being served, and he worries that if he has a solicitor and too few solicitors, that he doesn't have this wide variety, that some solicitors might let their own wishes, their own biases of friends' wishes trumping their clients, Dracula's wishes. He doesn't want that happening, and so he also asks even how easily he can accomplish things himself. And Jonathan mentions that Dracula is asking such detailed questions, is so well educated on the topic, that he would make an excellent solicitor himself. Jonathan mentions that Dracula thinks of everything, and Dracula asks if Jonathan has written anyone, and Jonathan uncomfortably says, "No, I haven't." And Dracula hands him 3 pieces of paper and 3 envelopes and says, do write your people, and you are going to tell them that you're going to be here for another month. And he's not asking, will you please stay for another month? He's saying, you're going to be here for another month. He's demanding it of Jonathan. Of course, Jonathan reiterates how strongly he feels like a prisoner, and he mentions that in Dracula's face, he picks up on that when he bows in acknowledgement of what Dracula said, that Dracula is seeing his victory, and that Dracula must be pleased with the trouble he sees on Jonathan's face because he knows he has mastery over him. Jonathan, he has these 3 pieces of paper and envelopes, and he mentions that he feels like somehow, no matter what he writes, Dracula's going to be able to read it, going to be able to see it. And he determines to limit his correspondence to very formal wording. And that when he writes to Mina, he wants to use shorthand. So Dracula and Jonathan are writing letters. Dracula's writing letters too. And then he turns them upside down and leaves the room. And Jonathan is like, ooh, I should try and take a peek at them. But before he's able to, he sees the handle of the door turning. And so he doesn't take a peek at what Dracula was writing. Dracula then gives Jonathan a very direct warning, and he says, do not fall asleep anywhere in this castle, in this house, that is not the room I have prepared for you. Don't fall asleep anywhere else. And it comes across as a very stern, intense warning. And he says there are bad dreams awaiting, essentially, those who sleep unwisely. And so, of course, we know how this chapter is going to end. Jonathan's going to fall asleep somewhere that he shouldn't. That's not the room that Dracula prepared for him. Some time passes. Jonathan is returning to his journal to recount more events that have transpired. He mentions that he has placed a crucifix over the head of his bed, that Dracula had left, and Jonathan goes to his room, but then he goes out and up some stone steps and looks out a window to the south. He is craving fresh air, craving at least a glimpse of freedom. Doesn't fully get that. It is a beautiful view, but he says he does still feel like a prisoner. And it is nighttime now, and he mentions that he feels like being a night creature is making him way more anxious. It's wearing on him a lot, physically and mentally and spiritually. And he says that going and getting some fresh air, even if it's night, the beauty of the view, it does help calm him a little bit. He leans out the window a little bit, and in so doing, he sees something that he was not meant to see. And what he sees is a head popping out of a window further down below him. Or maybe not quite below him, but it says to his left where Dracula's room would be. And so Jonathan moves to where he's a little bit more concealed, but he can still watch. And he proceeds to see Dracula crawl head first out his window and again, head first down the stone wall. His fingers and toes. He even says the fingers and toes. So not even saying his, not exactly even acknowledging humanness. He just says the fingers and toes gripping the stones. And he says it's like watching a lizard crawl down something. He is just overcome with repulsion. And he asks what manner of creature in semblance of a man is his Count Dracula. You know, he watches him crawl head first, cape flowing down around him, down the outer wall of the castle. And then we get 15th of May, journal entry, and Jonathan has observed Dracula crawl out the window again in that same manner. And Jonathan once again goes exploring, trying to find a way, or even just like a new area of this castle, so he feels like he has a little bit more control over where he's going. And of course, all the doors are locked. One of the doors, he does note, seems to have a newer lock on it, and he determines that the key for it must be in Dracula's quarters, and he wants to try and figure out how he can get it so that he can escape. At the top of one stairway, though, as he's roaming, he does find a door that at first seems like it's locked, but given a little bit of pressure, does open for him. He realizes that it had come off of its hinges and was resting on the floor, which is why it was so hard to open. Once he is pushed his way through into there, he realizes that he's in a wing of the castle that is further right and a story down from where his quarters usually are. And the windows show him that it's looking out over this great precipice, these cliffs, and he talks about how the castle itself is built on the corners of a large rock on this cliff edge, and he notes that it's a very secure location because no one can attack from this side, and so it's just that much more secure, but also that much more difficult to escape from. As he is looking around this wing of the castle that he's discovered, He notes how it's so very thickly covered with dust and moth-eaten and all of this stuff, but he does think it was once the woman's area, the ladies' rooms, because the furniture seems to be made more for comfort, and he feels very comfortable here, very at ease being in these new rooms. He describes how the panes of glass in the window are in diamond shapes, and the moonlight coming in through them kind of disguises the ugliness of the dust and wear and moth-eaten state of everything. He says part of why he is feeling so at ease here and way more comfortable is because the rooms that he's used to have been disturbed in his psyche by the presence of the Count so frequently. Jonathan then sits at an oak table and he muses on his place there and who may have been there in centuries past. Jonathan Harker, he sits there in this ancient space marked by an association with noblewoman, and he thinks about the blushing fair lady that may have once sat there and written a love letter. Here we have Jonathan imaginatively reaching back into history, picturing this courtly romance, innocence, and honestly a bygone world of human passion, even to their modern Victorian mind. He notes how the letter that he is imagining this woman must have written would have been spelt poorly. The words wouldn't have been written correctly. And he contrasts this, or juxtaposes it, with his own ability to write shorthand, which is very efficient, precise, and businesslike. And so on one hand, he's boasting of being this up-to-date man, but on the other side, he's experiencing this nostalgia, sensing that something potent really did reside in those older forms of communication. And so here he's acknowledging that the old world, with its romance and its superstition and its gothic emotional force, very much still lingers. And his rationalism, his writing in shorthand, cannot erase the psychic weight of centuries past passion and myth and fear that are embedded not only in this land but especially in this castle. And it is another aspect of this novel focusing on modernity, the modern times with the ancient uncanny. These musings of Jonathan Harker, they would resonate with a Victorian reader in the 1890s because at that time, culture itself was grappling with the advancement of technology, trains, typewriters, telegraphs, while at the same time there was this huge interest and revival in the occult and folklore and medieval romance. I think Dracula is a highly spiritually focused book. And so if we also look at this moment of him thinking about all of this, sitting at the oak table, there's also perhaps this idea about the Tower of Babel going on, where modern humanity thinks that the mastery of language and technology can replace depth of spirit. Yet there were powers of their own in those ill-spelt, ill-formed, heartfelt words, and they carried a sort of spiritual efficiency that shorthand efficiency cannot. And it shows that the soul of that old, ill-spelt love letter, however clumsy it may have been, is more alive than modern shorthand efficiency. So this small observation in this scene, it reveals a much larger tension. Jonathan Harker, he thinks he's insulated from the superstitious, romantic world of the past, but his own words betray that he feels this pull. In Dracula's castle, which is a repository of history and haunted memory, the past is proving it cannot be dismissed, and may very well soon overwhelm him. So we have that scene at the oak table, and then it ends that journal entry, and we have the next journal entry be the morning of I believe it says the 16th of May. And Jonathan writes that he is praying to God for his sanity. And he very well thinks that he could be going insane. And at this point now, in this journal entry, he's saying Count Dracula is mild compared to the other horrors that I have witnessed here. He talks about Shakespeare's Hamlet once again, and he says that he needs to write down what transpired. And I get the sense that he wants to write it down because almost in getting it on paper, getting it expressed out of himself, he's aiming to try and soothe himself a little bit and perhaps help his brain process what he just witnessed and experienced. It goes back to when he was sitting at that oak table in the woman's wing of the castle, and he falls asleep there because he's way more comfortable there. Even in spite of Count Dracula's warnings, do not go to sleep anywhere other than the room I provided you. He moved a couch to where he could look out over the beautiful scene and the moonlight from the window in that area, and he fell asleep. I believe he also even mentions he also just kind of enjoyed disobeying Dracula in that moment, and so he intentionally went to sleep there. And then he relates to the reader what happened. He says that he realized he was not alone, and in the moonlight he saw 3 young women. These 3 women, they did not cast shadows, and they just stood there and studied him for a while. He describes them, and 2 of them, he says, were dark and had aquiline noses, very much like Count Dracula. He says that they had dark, piercing eyes that, in comparison with the pale yellow moon, almost looked red. This description almost kind of hints at a kinship with Dracula, a similar bloodline. They look similar. The 3rd woman, however, he describes as fair as can be, meaning very light hair, light skin, all of that. Not necessarily describing in terms of beauty, but in terms of shades of light and dark. He said that she had golden hair that was in great, massive, wavy shape, and he describes her eyes like pale sapphires. And so I want to point out here that for him, there's probably a little bit more of a familiar look to her. Probably looks like someone that he would have courted back in England. She has a little bit more of that genetically English look to her. He even notes that he does seem to know her face with some dreamy fear. With her having this familiar look to him, it in this moment is blurring that boundary between home and foreign threat. It's this mingling of the familiar and the foreign. The ways in which the 3 women are all similar, they all have very white pearly teeth. They stand out against what he calls their voluptuous, which is another way of saying very full ruby red lips. This part starts to get a little strange in how tense the dichotomy of his 2 emotions are. And he almost, we could perhaps say, seems to be hypnotized. But then again, maybe not. Let me know what you think is going on with Jonathan in this scene, because it is very clear that he is very attracted to these 3 women. The text describes him as being very attracted, but also very afraid. And he says that he has this experience of wanting to be kissed by the ruby lips. And he says he doesn't want to write this down in the event that Mina would ever see this, because he knows that would bring her pain, that he's just trying to do a factual account of what he experienced and felt on this night. The 3 women then talk and laugh, and he describes their laughs as very ethereal, not normal essentially, but otherworldly. And he says the fair one shakes her head, but then is urged on by the other 2, and they're saying like, you go first, we'll follow. He's young and strong, and there are kisses for us all. And so Jonathan says that he sits there in delightful anticipation. He is afraid to move or open his eyes, but there's also with his words, you can tell a certain pleasure that's being derived from this experience. So the blonde one, she moves closer to him, bends over him, and then it's described in a very animal-like way. She, my understanding is, like arches and licks her lips and teeth and then descends down towards his neck. And she puts her lips and her teeth on his neck. And he says that, again, he's not moving, he's just sitting there waiting with what he describes languorous ecstasy. And with this kind of language, we can see that he is clearly being drawn in. He is not recoiling. And it's not describing necessarily terror, but almost this like delicious surrender for him. Perhaps at this scene we can see this as symbolic of sin, how temptation works, and how evil presents itself as desirable. My invitation to you is to think about what is going on here. Is it his Victorian sexual repression? Is it that these three women have this supernatural ability to put on this hypnotic glamour? Is it the power inversion that is giving Jonathan these feelings? What is happening to him? And Bram Stoker, the author, he's writing about this ambivalence between desire and death. The power of temptation in this scene is being given to the woman. It's very anti-Marian, these three women. They're anti-Marian figures, meaning Mary as in the mother of Jesus. They are not life-giving mothers, but death-bearing seductresses. And we almost can take this with the lens of them kind of being examples of sin being guised as beautiful, and show how the things that he is feeling, this languorous ecstasy, this delightful anticipation, how they are counterfeits for joy. The fleeting sweetness is masking this eternal loss. And so before anything happens to his neck, Count Dracula shows up, and he is in a fury. He is mad. He pulls back the fair one by her neck and tosses her aside. And as he does so, she again becomes very animalistic in her anger and thrashing about. And like I said, he throws her, and with the other hand, in the very same way that the driver, which Jonathan is believing to be Dracula, controlled the wolves, he calms the other two women. He scolds them and says that he forbade that they got near him. And one of the women, I believe it's the fair one, she accuses him of never loving, and the others laugh. And he responds that he can love. He says that they can kiss Jonathan all that they want when he's done with him. And then he tells the girls to go. And then the three women ask if they get anything tonight. And Dracula motions to a sack that he had thrown to the floor when he came in. And Jonathan Harker writes about how he hears a gasp and a low wail of a half-smothered child. The women descend on it and disappear with the child. They don't go through the door. Jonathan describes how he thinks they kind of faded out through the window, and then he passes out after this, describing the horror. And in this scene, I feel like with the three women, with Jonathan obviously being very physically attracted in those moments, it's building up this allure. But then the end of the chapter very clearly rips off the mask, showing how demonic the reality is beneath. And so up to this point, the vampire women have been portrayed with dangerous beauty. Harker himself even admits he's captivated. But then Bram Stoker rips away the veil. Dracula delivers to them a child, an innocent, defenseless victim, and the women fall on it like beasts. The spell of their beauty is shattered, replaced by something unspeakably evil. And I think this part of the book very much highlights how there's this inversion of maternal and feminine imagery. Normally, women are protectors of children, mothers, and nurturers. And that's okay, that's a good thing. It's how the human race goes on. And here they become predators of the innocent. That inversion would have been viscerally horrifying to Victorian readers, and it should still be viscerally horrifying to us today. It's the ultimate blasphemy of their femininity, the givers of life being transformed into devourers of life. And of course, Dracula, the Count himself, is not innocent in this. His part is just as wicked. He doesn't feed himself, he smothers the child and passes it off. It's a cold, calculated, grotesque parody of provision. Instead of fatherhood, he gives death. And it shows how his evil is more than just predatory hunger, it's active cruelty. So, in summary of all that, Stoker makes sure we can't mistake the vampires for glamorous anti-heroines. In the Three Women's case, he shows their true nature in the most shocking way possible. They turn on a stolen child. Dracula himself smothers the little one and hands it over to them. It's not just murder, it's an inversion of everything sacred about parenthood and protection. The moment rips away any illusion that these creatures are merely tragic or romantic. This is evil unmasked. And for me, this exemplifies why the true masculine and feminine matter. When they are rightly lived, men protect, provide, and give life. Women nurture, safeguard, and multiply life. When these roles are twisted, society collapses into horror. And so let's not just shudder at Dracula's evil, let's take it as a warning. When we abandon the truth of life, when men forsake their strength and women forsake their nurture, we feed the innocent to destruction. Our world desperately needs fathers who protect and mothers who cherish, because life itself depends on it. This scene is horrifying not just because of the violence, but because it shows the complete corruption of what was made good. The feminine, meant to cradle life, devours it. The masculine, meant to guard the weak, destroys it. And I think Stoker wants us to feel that horror so deeply that we can't mistake evil for anything else. My call to you is this: don't let our culture sell you the lie that life is disposable or that the masculine and feminine don't matter. We need fathers who protect and mothers who nurture, because life itself really does depend on it. If you take away other perspectives from this final scene and what it is portraying and perhaps saying about society and culture and feminine and masculine and all of that, please let me know in the comments down below. Of course, I'm always open to discussion and to analysis of literature, but please do so respectfully in the comments down below. That concludes this look at Chapter 3 of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And again, let me know your thoughts on this chapter, as well as let me know what brings you to my channel. Are you reading this as part of homeschool learning, public school learning, because you're interested to explore an old classic? What brings you here? As always, thanks for watching. If this video brought something to life for you, you can support my work through Buy Me a Coffee or explore the tools I use to create these series down below. Every little gesture truly does help keep this corner of bookish candlelight glowing.